What's up YouTube? My name is Ruff and today I want to go over 3 ways to make your production sound warmer and more analog. When someone says they want their productions to sound more analog, what they really mean is that they don't want the average listener to be able to tell that everything was made in the box on a computer in a DAW software. So there's a few things that we could do in our productions to make it not seem so digital and let the average listener be able to listen to the song and be like, okay, this is a song, it was made with instruments, and not really allow for someone to listen to your song and say, hey, everything was made digitally in a computer. So the 3 things that we're going to go over in this video is going to be adding real world sounds and textures to your music, utilizing saturation, and utilizing detune. So diving into Ableton and looking at what I mean by real world textures. So for example, I have a folder here in my sample folder. If I go to atmosphere, nature, life, and real world, you'll see I have city and life, nature and animals, and I like to use birds, dog park, forest. And these are just a few examples of samples I have that other sample pack companies or producers recorded in the real world to put in the background of my productions to give the listener something to latch onto very subtly. I usually put these at -36 to sometimes at the quietest, -42 decibels, very tucked away in the background of the song, but it's just there to add a real layer to your production. Because if you think back to when everything was recorded using microphones in a studio and there was no DAWs, sound could have crept in if there was an open window or if someone was talking in the other room and it got through. And those are just a couple like tiny little nuances from back in the day that when it was added into the production or found its way into the production actually made the song more realistic because everything was real. It was recorded live and there's going to be imperfections. There's going to be nature and outside world sounds that enter into your production when it's recorded live in a studio. So if you're not recording things live in a studio and you're doing everything in a DAW software like Ableton, taking sounds from the real world, even going outside with your iPhone and just recording the street or recording the birds or recording whatever you want and putting it in the background of your song is going to reintroduce that realistic feeling back into your productions. The second way to make your productions sound warmer and more analog is saturation. And my favorite third-party saturation plugin, Saturn by FabFilter, but we're gonna use the stock Ableton saturator for this video. And I'll make another more in-depth video about the nuances of saturation, but the basics that I wanna go over now is how to apply it to give a more warm and analog feel. So you'll see here on the Ableton stock saturator, you have a few different options going from analog clip down to wave shaper, which is gonna shape how the saturation comes through. And if I'm personally going for a more warm feel, I'm either gonna use the analog clip or the soft sine. And what I'll typically do is I'll set the drive to anywhere from around 3 to 6 decibels. And I'll typically place this on my drum bus, I'll place it on my guitar bus, and I'll place it on my synths bus. So each individual component within those buses are getting the same amount of saturation and the same kind of saturation, and it's gonna add a bit of warmth and glue those parts together. Going back to how saturation was initially discovered in the 20th century was because they were feeding too much input, and then the output that came back had this warmth and this texture to it that has now been digitally recreated in these plugins that we now have in our DAWs. So if you go and think back to, okay, when things were recorded live back in the 20th century, what were things that would typically get saturation? Guitars, synths, drums, vocals. I don't really see a need to like put saturation on sweeps and risers and effects, but the synths, the guitars, the drums, the vocals, those are gonna be pretty much locks that are gonna get the saturation. And then the third and final tip that I have for you on how to make your tracks more analog and warm sounding is detune. If you think again, what's a realistic scenario if I was recording stuff in my track live in the real world in the 20th century? The fact that things aren't gonna be 100% totally in tune is a big part of that. If your guitar is 100% tuned, fully, like perfect. That's not gonna sound as realistic as a slight bit of detuning. Same thing with a piano. Same thing with even your drums. Having a slight amount of detune across these elements, tiny bit, is gonna make it sound more realistic. And my third party recommendation for a detune plugin is Microshift by Soundtoys, but I'm gonna show you a way within Ableton that's applicable to other DAWs as well on how to achieve that detune without using a third party plugin. So if I pull up just a random guitar loop, we have this one here. And say that I felt, hey, this doesn't sound totally realistic, I want it to be slightly detuned. All I do, come over here to my pitch, and we're not gonna go in semitones, but we're gonna go in cents, and we're just gonna bring this down. Until it sounds good to your ear and it's all to taste. You can overdo it and go down a whole semitone, which is gonna put it out of key. So you wanna find that nice balance, usually around anywhere from like 20 to maximum 30 cents, negative or positive. If I turn it up. So that's perfectly in tune, slightly detuned. So to sum up, 3 easy ways to make your tracks sound warmer and more analog is tip number 1, add real world sounds deep tucked away in the background of your mix. Number 2, add saturation, especially to your drums, your synths, your vocals, and your guitars. And then the third is detune, especially on the same things I mentioned, your synths, your guitars, and your drums, to add that warm and analog feelings to make your track that's recorded in your DAW digitally have characteristics that allow for the listener to feel like, hey, this wasn't made in a computer, this is a real song using real instruments. Hope this video helped. I'll catch you next Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern. Peace.